Welcome to Reading with Robin. Today on the show, I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with author Sady Doyle, who is the author of Trainwreck, The Women We Love to Hate, Mock, and Fear, and Why. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Atlantic, Slate, BuzzFeed, and Rookie, among other publications. She is the founder of the blog Tiger Beat Down and won the first ever Women's Media Center Social Media Award. And today I am talking with her about her brand new book, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Monstrosity, Patriarchy, and the Fear of Female Power. Welcome to the program, Sady.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for writing this book. Can we just start with that?
Thank you for reading it. It's a very, very strange piece of work, and I was pretty convinced for most of the time I was working on it that, like, at some point somebody was going to shut me down. Somebody was going to say that, like, you can't attempt to explain the historical patriarchy with the movie Jurassic Park and get paid for that. Nobody's going to allow this. So for it to be out in the world and to know that people have actually read it is just such a strange experience.
Well, I imagine that because as we're speaking, this book just came out several days ago. And so you're really starting to, like, you had your launch event, and how did that go? That looked like it was a really fun event.
It was so wonderful. I got to speak with Talia Lavin, who is a great young writer who is a braver person than I. She covers specifically, like, white nationalist violence, and she's writing a book on that now. But we went out to Bookstore Magic, and we talked about female power and violence, and we had a really great time. And I think that hopefully, even though this book sort of starts from a place of talking about specifically, misogyny, and specifically it's about sexual violence and reproductive coercion, that all goes into the framework of these sort of rising fascist movements and the rising violence that we're seeing in America right now. Misogyny is often the first form of violence a man will practice, and it's the recruiting tool these other extremist movements will use to bring those guys in. This
book has given me so much to chew on, and I think that's one of the most amazing things that you've done is, like, the themes really reverberate, inside of you, and it's the kind of book that you want to talk about with people. So you and I were talking before we started taping about, like, giving this to, family members and all of that. But before we get too much into that, can you just walk us through, like, you said this book was kind of like a weird experiment. So why this book?
What I felt was that we had moved into a much darker moment for feminism and gender politics than any I had lived through. And I felt this specifically. I got pregnant. I found out I was pregnant basically a few days before the election of 2016. And I just remember sitting there and feeling like, I was about to embark on so many terrifying parts of my life. And I remember thinking that these narratives of progress and, I don't know, in a way, upward mobility for women that I had been fed my whole life were just, on some level, they were profoundly wrong, because now we were going to lose Roe versus Wade, which had always seemed permanent to me in my mind, but I knew we were going to lose it that night. Now we are, living through this gigantic reckoning with the Me Too movement, where we're finally talking about sexual violence and sexual harassment in the mainstream a lot. But after that passed, it went right back to the backlash, where it's like, how dare you not give Louis C.K. a job? How dare you not let this man have his comeback after he's been mildly embarrassed in public? Why can't he just come back and rape all his coworkers again? To realize the extent to which these really brutal, primeval ideas of patriarchy were still alive and well and governing the shape of women's lives, that to me felt urgent. And it felt like the best way to explore this was to go back to these real early texts, like from Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, that literally spoke about women as monsters. Texts where patriarchy was still kind of fresh in the public imagination, and it wasn't what we assume it to be now, which, like, now we've sold the idea of patriarchy as natural, as, like, the way things are. Back then, they kind of had to think it through, and they had to justify it. Why is man allowed to control women? Why shouldn't a woman have agency or ability to participate in public? And the answer they often came up with was that humanity is male, and because women have failed to be male, there's something wrong with them. There's something fundamentally defective and untrustworthy and immoral and amoral and scary about women, and that's why we have to keep the boot on their neck. The more I looked at monsters, the more I looked at images of female monsters in pop culture, in mythology, the more I saw images of women who were living outside of patriarchal rule, women whose bodies had somehow escaped the cage and were running around amok, whether that's sexually, whether that's in terms of like their level of reproductive agency, not, being a man's wife, not having kids with a man, being a voluntary single mother, or having, a family shape that's not the patriarchal nuclear family. All of these things that men were terrified of, these are the things we actually should be trying to be. These are the things we should actually be trying to uncover in ourselves. If you go to like a really enraged monster, I mean, like the T-Rex in Jurassic Park is my favorite. Yeah. But there's this movie Audition that I love as an example of this, where it's this guy who's just sort of casually sexist and gawks at women and treats all the women in his life terribly. And he holds an audition for the perfect wife. And the woman he picks is this sexual assault survivor named Asami. And she comes off as like the sweetest little cutie pie, like she only wears virginal white cardigan sets. She talks in a little whispery voice. And the second he makes her angry, she just ties him down to the floor and starts cutting his limbs off. And that seemed to me like a lot of people after November 2016, a lot of women I knew were in that mindset, where it's just like, okay, enough. I don't want to have a peaceful discussion about this. I want to get the piano wire out, and we're going to work this out man to man.
I love that. Well, I think this book absolutely does that. I mean, Kirkus called it unflinching, hard-charging feminist critique. And, I mean, that's got to feel pretty good. You got a starred Kirkus, and with that as the line, like, that's pretty hard to come by. Do you feel like you've kind of done or are doing what you set out to do with this book?
I think I gave myself permission to go pretty hard with this book. I think there's a certain point, and it's the first chapter in Mothers. It's the chapter on birth and childbirth, and like specifically the ways we've sort of pathologized that process, or the ways we dread, pregnant women, pregnant people, but like pregnant women in many of these myths. At a certain point, I wrote the sentence, "We do not need fathers." The idea that we've fundamentally been sold an idea of how our lives have to go, from the micro level of like who decides what in your house, to the macro level of what does your CEO look like, what does your president look like, what does your God look like? Because like in Western culture to date, they've pretty much all been white guys. This idea that like fundamentally there is a truth to the world, and that truth is not patriarchy. Patriarchy is a messed up, janky, ancient arrangement that is perpetually coming apart. We're having to slap it back together with duct tape every other day. And what if we just let the tower fall? And once I realized that like I could be that angry, and I could say that, and I could say let's burn things down, then I was able to go back through what had been a really difficult book to write, and it was some of these early drafts were just dreadful. Then I was like, okay, I know what I'm saying, and I know that at a certain point, like I'm just going to punch my foot down on the gas pedal, and we're going to go as hard as we can. And that, I think just reaching that point where I was able to do that, maybe I wouldn't have done it if I weren't in like a dark spot, if I weren't a new mom who was really stressed out trying to like maintain a career, if I weren't in a dark place with other things in my life. But I hit a point where I was like, we as a nation, we as women need to acknowledge how bad things really are, because then we can let loose. Then we can really we can run at this problem as hard as it needs to be run at. We can give it all we've got.
Totally. Well, and I feel like kind of in the vein of what this book is really, like the meat of it and what you're getting at, I feel like your writing style and your like unwillingness to back down on things, like it all clicks. You know what I mean? Like it all makes sense. Because I think that's in part like why so many passages are like underlined and starred in, like I said, different colors, because I really feel like, well, I'm a little bit of a nerd too, and I secretly just want to be back in school, but like on my own terms, and doing what I like. You write with this fervor, and you really like go for it, and I think that but you go for it in a way that I was also like, yes, like everything that you say makes tremendous sense, and like really does resonate and like you get it. You don't feel like you're reading some like didactic feminist text, but like just stuff that you latch onto. So I don't know. And I think part of what definitely helped is, and kind of when you were talking about Jurassic Park, is I was like, this seems like a very menial question, but like how did you choose the different kinds of references that you were going to make? Because you stuck Jurassic Park in, and I was like, wow, yes, totally. And the book starts off with, right? And the book like starts off with Mercy Brown, who, total side note, we live one town over from where that took place. Just where did you start?
It's strange. The book almost had to be written in like archaeological layers. Because I wanted to cast a really wide net. I wanted to, particularly since a lot of the layers, like one of the two main layers in this book is horror and the other is true crime. And those are both areas where if you're talking to fans of those genres, they tend to be people who really, really super duper know their stuff. You cannot come to that with like an amateurish or a done before analysis. You have to know exactly what you're talking about. So, I really, I watched every horror movie on Netflix and half of the ones on Amazon and a bunch of them on Hulu and some of them on YouTube.
I just want to know if you had weird dreams when you were doing all of this, but that's neither here nor there.
Oh, I absolutely did. I had terrible nightmares when I was doing home invasion movies. There are none of those even in the book, but they're also grounded, and they're the plots aren't spooky dooky monsters. It's just like, hey, here's a guy who's kind of a sociopath, and you accidentally let him into your house, and now he'll never leave, and you're gonna die. Those movies, I had a bunch of nightmares that week. But but that's what my nightmares are like anyway.
Right, I know. It's kind of sad when the truth is not so far from fiction. But I listened to maybe a month ago, I was listening to the podcast Man in the Window about the Golden State Killer, and I was home alone. I was locking all of the windows, double checking that the alarm system worked, which are things that I should be doing anyway. But I think you did cast a very I would say appropriately wide net, because all of the examples and the source material that you use as a jumping off point for this book really makes sense, and they're almost just nice little nuggets throughout the book. And I love how a lot of your chapters start with different quotes from you use Gaslight, which is a personal favorite.
Oh, I love that movie. Really just that. It was that I had to go through the contemporary pop culture, and then I had to ground that in how have these narratives actually played out in the world, and that's where I went back to true crime. And then I had to go even sort of further and deeper under that to the substrata of before all this was pop culture, it was mythology, right? Our culture's mythology is how we learn who to be. It's how we learn what our position is in the world. So where do I find this in the Bible? Where do I find it in ancient Sumerian texts? Where do I find this, in those early writings of, Aristotle or somebody, going all the way back to the very beginning of these stories, and then fast forwarding all the way forward to Jurassic Park, felt like the only way to really tell the story in full context. Tell the history of patriarchy as it sort of unfolds through our lives and through our imaginations over the millennia.
Absolutely. And I have to thank you, too, for the 40-page appendix.
Yes.
In the back of this book. For our listeners, if you're like I am, you are going to, thank you. That's all I have to say. It's such a good appendix.
Well, it's nuts because it should be, because everything in there pretty much, that would have been an 80-page appendix if I hadn't restrained myself. Everything in there at one point had its own full section in the book. This book was like the ship of Theseus. I put so much crap in there. And eventually I was like, we're not going to get there. We're not going to get to Wicker Man. We need to just have a place in the back where people can go and sort of see how much stuff there is and hopefully take their own weird journeys through mythology and find their own pathway through all this.
You have absolutely, I feel like this is part 2, or kind of the choose your own journey part of this book. Right? I was really geeking out a little bit, so thank you. But, it's funny because you mentioned we were talking about the references. You were talking about true crime, and that was one that you brought up. And it was interesting to me because I was having this conversation in a very different context with a friend recently, but kind of how true crime, especially among, millennial women, has become another sign of not being basic, but, you like pumpkin spice lattes, you like true crime. And it's just a thing that a lot of people are really interested in now, but you really dive into the why in the book. And so if you can maybe explain that a little bit, because I know a lot of our listeners are really big fans of true crime, but also domestic suspense and psychological thrillers. And to a lot of people, I think this trend just kind of seems to be that, a trend, but you get it that there's more to it.
Women need a public forum through which to discuss the very real forms of fear that they have to live with in their lives, the very real forms of violence that they have to live with in their lives. Even before true crime was seen as this basic millennial girl thing, it was like the Lifetime movie. And who watches the Lifetime movie?
Yeah.
Presumably it's a middle-aged woman who's a mom who lives in the suburbs who we assume just doesn't have any real problems. But what those movies are about over and over and over are about a woman who falls in love with a man, and they get married, and he tries to kill her, and he tries to beat her up. And I don't know how we can be at all at a loss as to why so many women want to watch that story when we also know that 25% of women have experienced not just violence, but so-called extreme violence in a partnership. And extreme violence is not that he punched you. Extreme violence is that he tried to burn you. It's that he strangled you. It's that you almost died. Women are brought up with this fear of sexual violence, which you see in why so many women love slasher movies and why so many women love to hear about, the Ted Bundys of the world, the nice, reasonable-looking guy who's actually going to do terrifying sexual violence to you. We're brought up with the knowledge that, if you walk down the wrong street, if you go to the wrong party, if you just look away from your friend at a party and you take your eyes off your drink, something horrible is going to happen to you or to her, and we live with that every day.
There's a quote on page 39 that I just like. This one has all of the markings in the margins, but you say that adolescent girls have spent their lives absorbing our cultural disgust for womanhood only to find themselves thrust into the middle of it, suddenly the butt of every joke. Their underlying anxieties are hit with a toxic sludge of predatory attention, sexual objectification, and impossible standards, growing to 50 times their natural size. I mean, that one just cut so deep.
It is. It's that thing. And I never want to say that there's only one way to be an adolescent girl. I think that one of the downfalls of this book is that it covers a sort of very normative woman's journey, and that means that sometimes we spend a lot of time on marriage, but it's mostly straight marriage we're talking about, or we spend a lot of time on puberty, but it's mostly a cis girl's puberty rather than a trans girl's puberty, which is a very different thing.
Totally.
But I definitely think that, there's no way to not absorb the culture's disdain for you. This is something that Hannah Gadsby talks about in Annette from sort of a different angle, where she talks about the fact that by the time she knew she was a lesbian, she was already also a homophobe because she had absorbed so much of the toxicity of her culture. And I watched that after I wrote this, thankfully. I didn't rip Hannah Gadsby off. But it's the same thing, I think, with any marginalized identity, is that by the time you have grown up and have assumed a full understanding that, you belong to this group and that you're historically oppressed and persecuted, you've also absorbed all of the rationales that culture has for why your objectification or your subjugation or your persecution is deserved. And you really have to just spend a lot of your young adulthood just sort of picking these shards of glass of trauma that have been embedded in you out of your body and trying to understand the explosion, understand how you've been kind of mangled by the world you grew up in. And if you don't do that, you wind up like some of the women in this book who pass down their own trauma note for note and wind up, creating terrible worlds for their children to live in.
Right. So then you have a very subtle but really beautiful dedication to this in your book, and I think that kind of goes in line with what you just said, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it, but you just say, for my daughter, may she always be ferocious.
Absolutely. Well, I think that for me, this is something I've always been interested in, is how different generations of feminism interact with each other. It really is a thing that, the relationship between a daughter and a father is a much more clear-cut rebellion than the relationship between a daughter and a mother a lot of the time. And yet, I keep seeing this thing happen over and over in feminist generations where, like, in order for one generation to come up, they kind of have to clear out the dead wood. They have to clear out the women who've come before them. And so, therefore, mothers always get cast as the villains in that narrative, right? It's like, I've grown up in this broken world, and you didn't fix it, and you didn't fix me, and it's your fault. And the mothers dismiss the daughters. It's, well, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm Sady Doyle. Who the hell are you? I do that too to women who are younger than me sometimes. So for this book, one of the many things I kind of wanted to do with it was to, like, really specifically, there's a section for daughters and there's a section for mothers. There's a section on daughterhood. There's a section on motherhood. I wanted us to start to understand that cycle, that a daughter is, what a mother was, and that these are the same person at different points that have maybe undergone different traumas, that some of us have succumbed, have gone under, have agreed to continue and perpetuate patriarchy. Others of us have been marginalized and feared and castigated and turned into cultural monsters because we refused or we rebelled. But I wanted to open that dialogue between mothers and daughters. And no, I don't think I would have been as fervently invested in it if it were not for the fact that, like, of all the things to be raising someone who's like, to be raising someone who's probably going to be a little girl, it's really, at this point in time in history, it's a lot. I want to know that there can be dialogue between daughters and mothers because I don't think we can survive without each other.
The last question is, it's pretty open-ended, but it's just like, and what comes next?
Well, the PS section, I don't know. I haven't written it yet. I think we need to abandon our previous models of power, our previous ideas of how to gain power and what power is legitimate. I think we need to radically re-envision how we think womanhood works, how we think families work, how we think desire works. And I think there are people doing that work every day. Not necessarily to further the cause, but we don't live in a strict patriarchy anymore. There are more and more families that no longer fit these traditional restrictive shapes. There are more and more women who are choosing to become single by choice. There are more and more queer parents who are able to use reproductive technologies to create families in new and unconventional ways. There are more and more people thinking about the question of, like, does a patriarchal nuclear family even really work? Like, do I need to be married to a person that I raise a baby with? Is it possible for us to have a more communal approach to this, that it isn't totally, down to one heterosexual marriage to make sure a child turns out right? We are increasingly breaking down these sort of old and hoary and, we know by now, dysfunctional models of being. There are things we can do to break it down further that are legislative, and they're often like really bread and butter things. Like Elizabeth Warren's plan for universal child care will work. That will do more for the status of women in this country than many plans I've seen introduced in the past few years. We need universal child care, and we need child care providers who, because they're providing feminized labor, are really just paid at the dirt end of the scale and who are exploited ruthlessly. We need them to be getting a living wage too. So that kind of thing, the kind of thing where we can break down patriarchy increasingly by, like, looking at how to reshape our politics so that we're giving women back reproductive autonomy that has been stripped from them over these past few years by the attacks on reproductive rights, so that we are keeping Planned Parenthood open. Planned Parenthood provides hormone replacement therapy, and my understanding is that it's on an informed consent basis, so that it's no longer this, like, horrific and punitive medical gatekeeping that so many trans people have had to deal with, so that we are providing child care in this country. Like, the more we do that, the more we work on our infrastructure so that every way of having a family, every way of being a woman engaged with the world is supported, the more that we're going to start to see these old systems break down. But on a more spiritual level, because so much of this book is not about policy. It's not about legislation. It's about mythology. It's about the way we're taught to see the world and see ourselves. We need to continually go back to the sources of our myths. If there's something you believe just is natural or is true about how women are, I guarantee you somebody came up with that at some point down the line. Dig into the stories you've read. Find out the ways you learn to be you, and ask yourself if that's who you want to be forever.
Well, with that, I have goosebumps and a lot of thinking to do. This is a book that needs to be read and needs to be discussed and all of the things. It's been a while since I've read a book that's really stirred me as much as this one, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Monstrosity, Patriarchy, and the Fear of Female Power by Sady Doyle. Sadie, it was to call it a pleasure to talk to you today is not doing it justice. I mean, truly an honor. I love this book. Thank you so much for writing it.
My gosh. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we can't wait to follow all the more that you do and really see this book have very, very long legs, because it is so important and so necessary. And thank you again so much.